We continue now at the top of Daf Ayin Amud Beis in Meseches Gitin. This is Gittin Daf 70b. On the previous summit, the Gemara says that there are 8 things that minimize the amount of semen that a person has, and one of them is bloodletting if it's on the lower half of the body. And the Gemara said that if it's on the lower half of the body, it actually causes double the amount of harm. And the Gemara now explains lamata. When we say the lower half of the body, lamata min habeitzim, we mean to say that it's below the testicles. Rashi says lamata min habeitzim kamo baraglov of a shuk of the point over here is that the bloodletting is done on the person's legs, for example. And lamala, when it says it's on the upper half of the person's body, lamala min habeitzim, it means it's above the person's testicles. Ukashus shalo bizmana, and then the Gemara had said earlier that if you have hops and it is not their proper time, meaning they're not ripe, that also causes harm. And the Gemara says Tana was taught kashem shakasha shalo bizmana, just like it causes harm when they are not ripe. Kachiyafa bizmana, so too it is beneficial if they are ripe. Amar Rav Papa says Zemana Tammuz, the proper time, meaning when are they ripe? That's during Tammuz, that's during the summer months. Shalo bizman, and when is it not the proper time? Teves, that's during Teves, that's during the winter months. Yomei Nisan v'Yomei Tishrei. Now, if it's during the days of Nisan or the days of Tishrei, meaning during the spring or the fall, lo malu, it's not beneficial. However, v'lo kashu, they also do not cause harm. And we will point out over here that kishus has different translations. Some translate it as haps, as we just translated, and some translate as dater, as we translated on the previous amud. And the Gemara continues at the 2 dots. The Mishnah said, Amar, if the person says, kisvu get l'ishti, he says, write a get for my wife, v'achazagu kordiakos, and then he's seized by kordiakos, v'chazor v'yamar, and then he says, al techtavu, don't write the get for my wife, ein devorav ha'achronim klum, so we don't listen to his latter words. In other words, we're still able to write the get, because when he said not to write the get, he has kordiakos, and therefore we consider that he is not in his proper mind. And the Gemara says, Reb Shimon ben Lakish says, Kosvin v'nosin get la'alter. Even if he's seized by kordiakos, we can write and give the get immediately. Even while he has this seizure of kordiakos, you can still give the get. Rabbi Yochanan says, no, that's not what the Mishnah means. The Mishnah just means, Ein kosvin ela l'chashiyishtafer. You're only able to write the get when he gets better. The point of the Mishnah, according to Rabbi Yochanan, is you don't have to ask him again if he wants to give the get. You can go by his initial instruction, but you do have to wait him to no longer have kordiakos in order to write and give the get. And the Gemara explains, my time in the Reish Lakish, what's the reason of Reish Lakish that they can write and give the get immediately? To Katani, because it says in the Mishnah, Ein b'dvarav ha'achronim klum, his latter words are nothing, meaning we don't consider them at all, and therefore it sounds like it's saying that they can write and give the get immediately. Rabbi Yochanan Amar Lach, and Rabbi Yochanan will respond to you, Ein b'dvarav ha'achronim klum, what it means to say that his latter words are nothing, D'luchi mitzel, lo tzarech l'mahadrim luchei bei, that when he gets better, you don't have to go back to him and ask again whether he wants to give the get. You can go by his initial instruction. But still, according to Rabbi Yochanan, you can't actually write the get until he heals. And the Gemara explains, what is the machlokas? What are they arguing about? Reish Lakish medami le'liyoshin. Reish Lakish compares a person who has kordiakos to somebody who's sleeping. Rabbi Yochanan medami le'lashota. But Rabbi Yochanan compares him to a shota, to an imbecile, and therefore you have to wait until he heals. And the Gemara says, Rabbi Yochanan nami lidme liyoshin, but Rabbi Yochanan also, why doesn't he compare him to somebody who's sleeping? And the Gemara explains, Yoshin lo mechusar ma'isa, somebody who's sleeping, nothing has to be done in order to heal the person. The person wakes up on his own. But this individual, mechusar ma'isa, there has to be some kind of medicine that's given to this individual. There has to be some kind of remedy, and therefore it's different. Reish Lakish nami nedami l'shota. Reish Lakish also, why doesn't he compare the person with kordiakos to a shota? And the Gemara answers to that, shota lo sami biyadin. When it comes to a shota, we don't have the remedy in our hands. But when it comes to this individual, sami biyadin, there's a remedy in our hands. Bisra sumka gumrei v'chamra merka. The remedy is to have lean meat that's roasted on coals and to have diluted wine. That's the remedy for kordiakos. But the Gemara continues, Umiyomer Rabbi Yochanan hachi, but does Rabbi Yochanan really say this? Does Rabbi Yochanan really say that we have to wait until the person gets better in order to write and give the get? V'yomer Rabbi Yehuda mar Shmuel, but Rabbi Yehuda said that Shmuel said, Shachat bo shnayim or rov shnayim, let's say the person is slaughtered, he has 2 of the simonim of his lungs or of his throat are slaughtered, or maybe the majority of the 2 of them. V'ramas, but he hints, V'yomer, and he says, Kisvu get le'ishti, he says to write a get for my wife. Harayelu yichtavu v'yinu, they're allowed to write the get and they can give the get. You see that even though he's in this this state, they're still allowed to write and give the get. And yet Rabbi Yochanan says that they have to wait until he gets better when it comes to Kordiakos. V'Tanya, and similarly, we learned in a Brisa, Ra'uhu Meguyed, if we see that he's all cut up, Otzolav, or we see that he's at the gallows, Otzolav al Atzliva, he's hanging at the gallows, V'Ramaz, and he gives a hint, V'Yamar, and he says, Kisvu get Ishti, write a get for my wife. Harayelu Yichtavu V'Yidnu, they're allowed to take that instruction, and they're allowed to write, they should write and give the get. And the Gemara says, Hachiyash, to what kind of comparison are you making? Hasam Daitatzilusa, in these cases over there, so the situation is, Daitatzilusa, he is a situation where his mind is clear. He just has a situation where weakness is beginning. He's beginning to die. He has a certain weakness, but his mind is still good, and therefore we take his instruction, and they can write and give the get. But over here, in the case of Rabbi Yochanan, Daita Shagishti, you have a situation where the person is not in his right mind, and therefore you're not allowed to write and give the get at a time that the person is not in his right mind. But the Gemara continues, but does Shmuel really say this in a situation, again, where the person is about to die, shachat bo shnayim or rov shnayim, or let's say he's hanging at the gallows, does he really say that's the case? V'yamar Rav Yehuda mar Shmuel, but Rav Yehuda says that Shmuel says, shachat bo shnayim or rov shnayim, in the same kind of case, let's say the person he had a shchita in two of his simonim by the throat, or the majority of two, uvarach, and he runs away, me'idin olav, so we're allowed to testify about him that he died. So in other words, you see that a person who has this kind of mortal wound is already considered dead, and therefore how could Shmuel say that in such a situation, when the person says, write a get for my wife, that they're allowed to write and give the get? Now, if you think like Shmuel says that the person is still considered alive, so why would it say, why would Shmuel say over here that they're allowed to testify about him that he's dead when he's really alive? And the Gemara explains, no, Amri, they answer as follows, Chayhu v'sof olamas. What we mean to say is, yes, he's alive at this moment, at the time that he's shechted and he hasn't yet died, so he's still alive, but he's certainly going to die, and therefore if you wait a reasonable amount of time, you can assume that he died, and that's why they're allowed to testify about him that he has died. But the Gemara says, but according to that, Yehei Gola al Yado, if you were saying that he's alive, but he's certainly going to die, so if somebody, let's say, does this to him by mistake, the person should have to go to Golus, the person should have to go to exile. Alomatanya, why do we learn in the Brisa? Shachat bo shnayim or rov shnayim, that if he shechts two of his simonim, or the majority of two of his simonim, harei no Gola, the person does not go to Golus. And the Gemara says on that, we say, Itmar Allah, it was said on that, Amar of Hoshia, that Rav Hoshia says, Chayshinon shema haruach bilbalto, in the case of a situation, a person shechted another individual, two of his simonim, or the majority of two of his simonim, so we're afraid that really he didn't die of that wound. Maybe what happened is that the wind, that causes death to happen faster. Inami hukir of esmisas, or maybe he himself was writhing in pain, and that caused him to die faster, and therefore essentially he brought about his own death, and that's why we say that the individual who shechted him by mistake does not go to Golus. And the Gemara says, "My beinayu, what's the difference between these two opinions in terms of whether you say it's the wind that caused it or that he caused it because he was writhing in pain?" And the Gemara answers, "Ika beinayu, the difference is the shachted bebeisa the shishu pirchas." Let's say you have a situation where he was shechted in a marble house, there's no wind, and his situation was that he was writhing in pain. So then, if you're going to say that hu kirav esmisasa, that could happen in that situation. But if you're going to say that the wind is what caused him to die faster, so that can't happen when the person is in an enclosed house. Inami, or you can have a difference as follows: the shachte bebara. Let's say he was shechted outside, there is wind. However, velo pirchas, but he was not writhing. So in that case, you could say that it was caused by the wind, but you can't say that he himself caused himself to die faster. And the Gemara continues at the two dots. The Mishnah said, "Nishtatek v'yamar lo nichtov get le'ishtecha v'chulu." It said, let's say the person is mute, and they say to him, "Should we write a get for your wife?" And he indicates, he nods, and he says yes. So then we test him, we make sure that he knows what he's saying, and then we write the get for his wife. And the Gemara says, "V'leichush," but shouldn't we be concerned? Dilma shechya de lav nokte inami shechya de hein nokte. Maybe if we're testing him, we're asking him questions where the answer is always no. So maybe he always shakes his head no. Maybe it doesn't prove he knows what we're talking about. Or maybe the other way around, if we ask him questions where the answer is yes, maybe he always nods his head yes, and it doesn't prove he knows what he's talking about. And the Gemara says, Amar of Yosef bar Menyume, Amar of Nachman, of Yosef bar Menyume says that Rav Nachman says, that we alternate. We ask him a yes question, and then a no question. That way we know that the person understands. But the Gemara says, but maybe he's nodding and then shaking his head. He's doing it in an alternating fashion, and maybe he doesn't know. Maybe he doesn't understand. And the Gemara says to that, we give him one question where the answer is no, and then two questions where the answer is yes. Then we give him two questions where the answer is no, and one question where the answer is yes, and therefore if he answers correctly, it is clear that he understands what we're saying. And the Gemara continues, Devei Rabbi Shmuel, Tana was taught in the yeshiva of Rabbi Shmuel, Omrim lo, Devarim shal yemos hachama b'yemos hageshamim. We tell him things that have to do with the summer season during the winter season, the rainy season, v'shal yemos hageshamim b'yemos hacham, or things that have to do with the rainy season during the summer season. And again, if he's able to answer properly, we know that he understands what we're saying. And the Gemara says, what are we referring to when we talk about things in the summer season and things in the winter season? Elaim, if you're going to say glufkuri, we're talking about, let's say, a coat. Vesadine, we're talking about linen. In other words, a person would normally wear a coat in the winter. If he says in the summertime he wants that, it would be a proof he doesn't know what we're talking about, or the other way around. Sadine, linen that's normally used in the summer. And if he indicates properly the summer, then we know he understands. If he indicates the winter, he doesn't understand. But the Gemara says, Leichosh dilma, kora achde, nami chama achde. But it's no proof at all. Maybe we're talking about a situation where the person has the chills, so even in the summer he requires a coat. Or maybe we're talking about a situation where the person feels hot, so even though it's the winter, but still he feels hot, he wants the linens that are normally used in the summer. And we will continue with this discussion in the next video on Daf Ayin Aleph Amud Aleph.